To pay off his massive gambling debts, my own father sacrificed me to the Empire's most ruthless, insane duke. Everyone was absolutely certain I would not survive the wedding night. They had even prepared my coffin. But the next morning, when my cruel brother gleefully kicked open the door to collect my corpse, he collapsed in pure terror. Because the legendary, bloodthirsty beast who had torn apart countless enemies was currently kneeling obediently at my feet, kissing the hem of my dress with desperate, red-rimmed eyes. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The iron gates of Blackwood Manor screamed as they swung open in the dark. Rain lashed violently against the wooden carriage windows. Charlotte sat perfectly still in the freezing shadows. She wore a thin white silk dress meant for a human sacrifice. Her father had sold her this morning without a single second thought. He traded his youngest, most beautiful daughter to clear his massive gambling debts. Her cruel stepmother had actually smiled as the carriage pulled away from their home. Duke James of the Blackwood territory was not considered a normal man anymore. He was known across the entire empire as a terrifying, heartless monster. He was once a brilliant war hero, but the brutal northern campaigns had broken his mind. Now, dark rumors said he was a violent, out-of-control, drunken beast. Every unfortunate woman sent to him before had been carried out in a wooden coffin. Charlotte knew her greedy family fully expected her to die tonight. They desperately wanted her dead so they could legally claim her late mother's inheritance. Her beautiful face was incredibly pale, but her heart was completely calm. She absolutely refused to give them the sick satisfaction of seeing her fear. The heavy carriage abruptly stopped in the muddy, desolate courtyard. The terrified driver jumped down and ran away into the storm without opening her door. Charlotte stepped out of the carriage into the freezing mud entirely alone. No servants came out to the courtyard to greet the new bride. The massive oak doors of the grand stone manor stood slightly open. The dark, echoing hallway smelled of old polished wood and spilled gin. Thunder rattled the tall, ancient stained glass windows high above her head. Charlotte walked slowly and purposefully up the grand sweeping staircase. Her bare feet made absolutely no sound on the thick, dusty velvet carpet. She reached the master bedroom at the very end of the long, silent hall. The heavy mahogany door was already broken entirely off its iron hinges. Inside, the enormous room was pitch black and freezing cold. A sudden, blinding flash of lightning illuminated the sheer destruction inside. Shredded velvet curtains hung in pathetic rags from the massive windows. Broken glass and ruined antique furniture covered the expensive hardwood floor. A low, terrifying growl suddenly echoed from the darkest corner of the room. Charlotte did not turn around and run away. She stood her ground firmly with her chin held high. A massive, intimidating figure stepped slowly out of the deep shadows. Duke James was covered in a cold sweat and thick, jagged old scars. His dark eyes were wild, completely unfocused, and heavily bloodshot. He held a heavy, half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey loosely in his left hand. The heavy, suffocating scent of a furious alpha instantly filled the cold air. It was deeply overwhelming and violently aggressive. Any normal person would have fainted instantly from the crushing atmospheric pressure. Charlotte simply took a steady, deliberate step forward. James dropped the heavy glass bottle. It shattered violently into 100 shiny pieces against the cold stone floor. He lunged at her across the room like a starving, desperate predator. His massive, scarred hands tightly grabbed her fragile, delicate shoulders. The sheer physical strength of the angry man was absolutely terrifying. Charlotte looked directly up into his furious, deeply broken eyes. She did not beg for her life. She did not shed a single tear of weakness. Instead, she calmly and quietly released her own hidden scent. It was the soft, incredibly soothing scent of white roses right after a summer storm. It wrapped gently around the deeply traumatized Duke like a warm, protective blanket. The violent, chaotic alpha energy in the room shifted instantly. James froze completely still in his heavy tracks. The wild, animalistic madness in his dark eyes began to painfully crack and fade. His heavy, ragged breathing suddenly slowed down to a steady, quiet rhythm. The painful, violent grip on her fragile shoulders loosened immediately. He blinked hard, looking down at her beautiful, calm face in pure confusion. The endless, bloody war raging inside his traumatized mind suddenly stopped. Charlotte reached her small hand up and gently touched his scarred, rough cheek. Her warm touch was incredibly light but unbelievably firm and grounding. James let out a deep, broken, and shuddering breath that visibly shook his chest. His massive, heavily muscular body began to tremble uncontrollably. The terrifying, undefeated beast of Blackwood Manor slowly sank down to his knees. He collapsed right onto the dangerous broken glass covering the floor. He buried his handsome, heavily scarred face deeply into the soft fabric of her white dress. He clung desperately to her narrow waist like a lost, terrified child. His legendary arrogant pride was completely and utterly stripped away. Hot tears of pure, overwhelming relief spilled from the fearsome Duke's closed eyes. "Do not leave me in the dark," he whispered in a raw, hoarse, pleading voice. Charlotte looked down quietly at the most feared man in the entire empire. She could feel his massive heart beating wildly against her knees. The heavy gold ring on his shaking finger caught the dim light of the storm. It was the absolute symbol of the Blackwood fortune and infinite power. Her greedy father had always desperately wanted access to that exact fortune. He thought sacrificing his own blood would somehow earn him favor with the beast. He was completely and utterly wrong. Charlotte looked out the shattered window into the dark, raging storm. A quiet, extremely dangerous smile slowly touched the corners of her soft lips. She was no longer the helpless, discarded daughter of a ruined house. She was now the sole master of the absolute strongest weapon in the empire. When the sun finally rose, the entire balance of power would shift forever. Nobody in her family would ever dare to look down on her again. She would walk back into her father's grand estate as a powerful queen. And she would proudly bring her new, fiercely loyal hound right beside her. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy, grey clouds over Blackwood Manor. Inside the ruined master bedroom, the air was completely silent and still. Charlotte sat elegantly on the very edge of the massive, torn velvet bed. Her white silk dress remained completely spotless and perfectly clean. It deeply contrasted with the violent destruction scattered all around her. At her bare feet lay James, the terrifying Alpha Duke of the North. He was currently fast asleep, resting his heavily scarred head gently against her knee. His massive, heavily muscular arms were wrapped securely around her fragile waist. Even in his deep, exhausted sleep, he absolutely refused to let her go. The terrifying, chaotic scent of his post-war madness was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, deeply comforting aroma of dark cedar and fresh rain. Charlotte slowly ran her pale fingers through his thick, dark hair. She was carefully calculating her next extremely dangerous move against her family. Suddenly, heavy, arrogant footsteps echoed loudly in the stone hallway outside. It was certainly not an apologetic servant bringing breakfast. It was someone deeply familiar and incredibly unwelcome. The broken mahogany door was forcefully kicked open the rest of the way. A tall, sharp-faced man stepped arrogantly into the ruined bedroom. It was Marcus, her cruel older brother and her greedy father's favorite heir. He had come personally this morning to quickly collect her dead body. He needed official proof of her death to immediately claim her mother's inheritance. Marcus held an expensive scented handkerchief over his nose in pure, visible disgust. "Where is the pathetic corpse of my little sister?" he sneered loudly. His cruel, careless voice completely shattered the peaceful silence of the morning. James instantly snapped awake at the loud, threatening sound. The fierce protective instincts of the traumatized alpha flared up like wildfire. Before Marcus could take another arrogant step, James was completely on his feet. The massive Duke moved with terrifying, almost inhuman speed. He firmly placed his huge, scarred body directly in front of Charlotte. A low, bone-chilling growl erupted from deep within his broad chest. His dark, intense eyes locked onto Marcus with absolute, focused murderous intent. The oppressive, suffocating weight of a furious alpha instantly filled the room again. Marcus dropped his expensive handkerchief in sudden, absolute terror. His arrogant face turned completely white as all the blood drained away. He instantly realized that the dark rumors of the Northern Beast were entirely true. But the legendary beast was not turning around to tear his fragile sister apart. The beast was actually baring its sharp white teeth directly at him. "Take one more step toward my mate," James growled in a deep, dark voice. "And I will gladly rip your arrogant head clean off your shoulders." Marcus began to tremble uncontrollably, his knees shaking violently in his boots. He desperately tried to step backward, but the crushing alpha pressure froze him in place. He slowly looked past the terrifying monster to see his sister sitting on the bed. Charlotte was not dead, and she was certainly not crying in fear. She was looking at her cruel brother with absolute, freezing indifference. She slowly stood up, placing a small, gentle hand on James's massive, tense back. The terrifying Duke instantly leaned into her warm touch, slightly calming his rage. However, his deadly eyes never once left Marcus's pale, heavily sweating face. "You came entirely too early, brother," Charlotte said in a smooth, quiet voice. "I am afraid I am still very much alive and well this morning." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, weak gasp came out. He simply could not comprehend the impossible scene unfolding right before his eyes. The broken, violently insane Duke was completely under her absolute control. "You expected to find my torn body scattered among this broken glass," she continued coldly. "You desperately wanted to steal my mother's fortune and leave me in an unmarked grave." James let out another vicious, threatening snarl, stepping closer to the trembling man. Charlotte gently squeezed his broad shoulder, silently holding the massive beast back. "Go back to our greedy, pathetic father, Marcus," she commanded with absolute authority. "Tell him the Duke of Blackwood is incredibly pleased with his new bride. Tell him I will be coming home very soon to collect what rightfully belongs to me." Marcus nodded frantically, completely and utterly terrified out of his mind. The crushing, suffocating alpha pressure finally lifted just enough for him to move his legs. He violently turned and ran desperately down the long, dark hallway like a complete coward. He did not even dare to look back once as he fled the terrifying stone manor. Charlotte watched him run away with a cold, victorious smile touching her beautiful face. The very first crucial piece of her grand revenge had fallen perfectly into place. James slowly turned around, his wild eyes immediately softening as he looked down at her. He gently took her small, delicate hand in his massive, heavily scarred ones. He brought her pale fingers to his rough lips, kissing them with absolute devotion. "They will never hurt you again," he whispered with dark, heavy sincerity. "I will gladly destroy anyone who even looks at you with a hint of disrespect." Charlotte smiled softly, reaching up to gently touch his handsome, rugged face. "I know you will, my sweet Duke," she murmured quietly in the dim morning light. She now held the absolute power of life and death over her entire cruel family. The innocent, easily discarded daughter of the house was officially dead and gone forever. The new, completely untouchable Queen of the North had finally awakened. And she was going to burn her former family's entire arrogant empire straight to the ground. She would make them pay in blood for every single tear she had shed in the past. Her father would beg on his knees for mercy when she finally returned to their grand estate. Her evil stepmother would lose every single piece of her stolen luxury. The storm outside finally broke, letting a single bright ray of sunlight hit the wooden floor. It perfectly illuminated the massive gold ring still shining brightly on the Duke's left hand. Charlotte gently traced the ancient family crest beautifully carved into the heavy gold. With this incredible, absolute power, nothing in the entire world could ever stop her now. The sad, pathetic game of survival was completely over. The glorious, blood-soaked game of revenge had just officially begun. The grand dining hall of the Belmont estate was filled with joyous, obnoxious laughter. Baron Belmont, Charlotte's cruel father, was hosting a lavish afternoon feast for his friends. He was heavily celebrating the successful removal of his youngest, most troublesome daughter. His wicked wife wore a stunning new diamond necklace purchased with stolen funds. They fully believed Charlotte was currently rotting in the freezing, bloody ground of the north. They thought the terrifying, insane Duke had already ripped her to absolute shreds. Suddenly, the massive double doors of the grand dining hall were violently blown open. The heavy oak wood splintered loudly under an immense, terrifying physical force. The cheerful festive music instantly stopped as a freezing northern wind swept into the room. A towering, heavily armored regiment of the Duke's elite royal guard marched inside. They quickly surrounded the terrified noble guests with their sharp silver swords fully drawn. Then, the true waking nightmare of the Belmont family finally stepped through the doorway. Charlotte walked gracefully into the grand room wearing a magnificent dark velvet gown. She looked exactly like an untouchable, absolute goddess of dark, divine vengeance. Right beside her walked James, the legendary and heavily scarred Alpha Duke. He moved with the silent, lethal grace of a massive, extremely dangerous apex predator. His dark, murderous eyes calmly scanned the terrified room, daring absolutely anyone to move. Baron Belmont dropped his extremely expensive crystal wine glass right onto the marble floor. It shattered into a million sharp pieces, perfectly matching his suddenly destroyed reality. "See, Charlotte," the pathetic Baron stammered weakly, his face turning an unhealthy shade of grey. "But you were given to the beast. You are supposed to be entirely dead," his wife screamed in horror. James let out a low, terrifying snarl that visibly vibrated the ancient stone walls of the estate. The crushing, suffocating weight of his furious alpha pheromones hit the entire room like a heavy hammer. Every single arrogant noble guest immediately fell to their weak knees in pure, unadulterated terror. Charlotte raised a single, elegant gloved hand to gently silence her furious, protective mate. James instantly obeyed her silent, calm command, stopping his highly aggressive advance. He stood firmly right behind her delicate shoulder, his massive hand resting protectively on her waist. Charlotte looked down at her violently trembling father with a cold, completely unforgiving smile. "I am very much alive, father, and I am the new, official Duchess of Blackwood," she announced clearly. "I did not come back here today to simply buy out your pathetic, disgusting gambling debts. That would be far too easy, and frankly, completely beneath my newly elevated station." The Baron looked up at his powerful, unrecognizable daughter with raw panic in his watery eyes. "Then why are you here?" he whispered, his entire frail body shaking violently in his expensive suit. Charlotte pulled a thick, official parchment sealed with black royal wax from her elegant sleeve. "My husband has been secretly auditing the royal trade routes running through our northern territories," she explained smoothly. "It seems your massive, embarrassing gambling debts were not just a private family matter after all. You have been illegally taxing the Duke's merchants and stealing directly from the royal military supply lines." The wicked stepmother gasped loudly, clutching her expensive new diamond necklace in sudden, sheer panic. "Treason and grand theft against a sitting Duke is punishable by immediate, bloody execution," James growled darkly. The Baron fell completely forward, pressing his sweaty forehead desperately against the cold stone floor. "Please. Have mercy on your own flesh and blood, my sweet daughter," the miserable man cried out loudly. Charlotte stepped much closer, looking down at the pathetic creature who had eagerly sold her life away. "You sold your own flesh and blood to a supposed monster, hoping I would be brutally torn apart," she whispered coldly. "You have absolutely no right to ever speak of family, love, or mercy to me again." She gestured elegantly to the heavily armed captain of the Duke's terrifying royal guard. "Arrest the Baron and his entire immediate family for high treason against the Northern Crown," she commanded flawlessly. "Confiscate this entire grand estate and strip them of every single stolen asset inside of it. My late mother's true, beautiful legacy will finally be wiped entirely clean of your filthy, disgusting presence." The armored guards moved forward instantly, grabbing the screaming stepmother and the openly sobbing Baron. They dragged the pathetic, ruined criminals roughly toward the heavy wooden front doors. Marcus, her cruel brother, tried to secretly run away through the back servants' entrance in the chaos. James moved far faster than a bolt of lightning, intercepting the cowardly heir in a single, powerful leap. He grabbed Marcus by the collar, throwing him completely effortlessly across the grand dining room. "Nobody escapes the Duchess's absolute, perfect justice," James sneered, his sharp fangs barely visible in the light. Charlotte walked slowly and purposefully over to the head of the grand, ruined dining table. She calmly poured herself a fresh, dark glass of extremely expensive red wine. She took a slow, elegant sip while listening to the desperate, fading screams of her ruined family. For the very first time in her entire painful life, the sweet taste of absolute victory filled her mouth. The suffocating, dark nightmare of her deeply abusive childhood was officially over forever. She had not just barely survived the terrible darkness, she had completely and utterly conquered it. James walked quietly back to her side, his wild, dangerous eyes full of deep, burning adoration. He gently took the heavy wine glass from her delicate hand and set it down on the table. He pulled her soft, warm body firmly against his heavily muscled, beautifully scarred chest. "Is the terrible work finished, my beautiful queen?" the fearsome alpha asked in a low, incredibly gentle whisper. Charlotte rested her head against his steady, racing heart, feeling completely and entirely safe. "The painful past is finally completely dead," she replied softly, her eyes shining with pure, bright determination. "Now, my sweet beast, we return to the north and build our very own empire." The journey to the frozen northern territories took 3 exhausted, painfully long days. Charlotte watched the lush green forests slowly turn into harsh, deadly snow-covered mountains. She rode comfortably inside the Duke's massive, heavily armored iron royal carriage. James never left her side for a single second during the entire freezing trip. He sat quietly in the dim light, constantly watching her with deep, protective adoration. The terrifying alpha beast was completely at peace as long as she was physically near. Eventually, the massive black stone walls of the northern military fortress finally appeared. This was the absolute heart of the Duke's legendary, completely undefeated army. Thousands of heavily armed soldiers stood in perfect, silent rows to welcome them. However, their cold eyes were completely filled with heavy, unspoken doubt and deep suspicion. The seasoned northern generals did not believe a fragile southern woman could ever survive here. General Thorne, the oldest and most respected commander, stepped forward to greet his master. He looked at Charlotte's delicate pale skin and expensive silk dress with poorly hidden disgust. He fully expected her to cry and beg to go home within the very first miserable week. Charlotte noticed their silent disrespect immediately, but she kept her beautiful face completely calm. She knew that earning their true loyalty would require far more than just a fancy legal title. She needed to show them exactly why the terrifying Duke of Blackwood belonged strictly to her. That very night, a sudden, extremely violent Arctic thunderstorm violently hit the ancient fortress. The heavy stone walls shook as massive thunderclaps exploded fiercely in the dark winter sky. The terrible, deafening noise sounded exactly like the heavy enemy cannons from the Great War. Deep inside the master quarters, James suddenly snapped awake in pure, blinding terror. His worst, most deeply buried combat nightmares violently seized his badly traumatized brain. He leaped out of the heavy wooden bed, roaring loudly like a wounded, desperate wild animal. The crushing, suffocating weight of his fully unleashed alpha pheromones instantly destroyed the room. Heavy oak furniture was quickly smashed into tiny splinters by his sheer, terrifying physical strength. 5 elite royal guards immediately rushed into the dark room to try and physically contain him. James threw them all violently backward through the heavy wooden door with a single brutal strike. The terrifying, absolutely unstoppable monster of the North had completely taken over his mind. General Thorne ran down the stone hallway, drawing his sharp silver sword in total, absolute panic. He quickly ordered the terrified soldiers to form a defensive wall, preparing for the absolute worst. They all completely believed the beautiful new Duchess was already dead inside that ruined room. Suddenly, the broken wooden door opened slightly wider in the dark, extremely dusty hallway. Charlotte stepped gracefully out of the deep shadows, wearing only a thin, white cotton nightgown. She was completely unharmed, and her beautiful expression was incredibly calm and fiercely focused. "Put your completely useless swords away immediately," she commanded the terrified generals coldly. She turned around and slowly walked straight back into the pitch-black, incredibly dangerous room. General Thorne gasped loudly, fully expecting to hear the sudden, sickening sound of her brutal death. Inside the freezing room, James was violently tearing the heavy stone fireplace completely apart. His massive, heavily scarred hands were bleeding deeply from the sharp, heavily broken rocks. He was entirely lost in a dark, bloody hallucination of a horrific, long-forgotten past battle. Charlotte completely ignored the suffocating, deadly alpha pressure forcefully crushing her small lungs. She walked completely barefoot across the sharp, broken wood and completely ruined stone floor. She stopped directly behind the towering, furious beast and gently reached out her small hand. She wrapped her soft, delicate arms tightly around his massive, violently shaking waist. She pressed her warm, beautiful cheek directly against his cold, heavily sweating muscular back. Instantly, she released a massive, overwhelming wave of her deeply soothing white rose scent. It was not just a simple, gentle comfort this time, it was an absolute, completely dominant command. The pure, highly concentrated omega pheromones cut straight through the thick, bloody madness. James froze instantly, completely dropping a massive piece of broken stone from his bleeding hands. The terrible, deafening phantom cannons in his deeply broken mind suddenly went entirely silent. He slowly turned his massive body around, looking down at her with wide, highly confused eyes. "Charlotte," he whispered softly, his deep, hoarse voice cracking with raw, unbearable emotional pain. "I am exactly right here, my brave soldier," she answered sweetly, reaching up to touch his face. "The terrible war is finally over, and you are completely safe at home right here with me." The fearsome, entirely undefeated Duke of the North completely collapsed against her fragile shoulder. He buried his heavily scarred face into her soft neck, sobbing quietly like a deeply broken man. Charlotte gently stroked his thick dark hair, holding his massive weight with truly impossible strength. Outside the dangerously broken doorway, General Thorne and his elite soldiers stood completely frozen. They had just witnessed an absolute, completely impossible miracle right before their very own eyes. The deadliest weapon in the entire empire had just been instantly tamed by a single, gentle touch. General Thorne slowly dropped his highly polished silver sword onto the freezing cold stone floor. He dropped heavily to one single knee, bowing his proud head in absolute, undeniable deep reverence. Every single heavily armed soldier in the extremely long hallway immediately followed his prime example. The loud, Heavy clanking of their thick iron armor echoed loudly down the dark, ancient stone corridor. They were certainly no longer kneeling to the terrifying Duke out of pure, suffocating physical fear. They were willingly kneeling to the tiny, beautiful southern woman who had just miraculously saved his soul. Charlotte looked out at the massive kneeling army directly over her husband's broad, violently shaking shoulder. Her beautiful, pale face remained perfectly calm, completely devoid of any foolish, childish arrogance. She had successfully conquered the absolute very heart of the treacherous, unforgiving Northern Territory. The absolute, unwavering loyalty of the most powerful military force in the world now belonged completely to her. With her deeply protective beast right at her side and a massive army at her back, she was truly untouchable. She gently kissed the broken Duke's scarred cheek as the terrible winter storm outside finally began to quickly fade. Winter had settled peacefully over the Northern Territories for 3 quiet months. Charlotte had completely transformed the cold, harsh military fortress into a true home. James was no longer a broken, terrified prisoner of his own dark mind. He spent his days training his elite army with sharp, absolute precision. He spent his nights fiercely worshipping his beautiful, incredibly clever wife. The dangerous, bloody madness of his past was firmly locked away forever. However, true absolute power always attracts deeply jealous, greedy enemies. A magnificent royal messenger arrived at the massive fortress gates on a white horse. He carried a heavy golden scroll sealed with the Emperor's personal red crest. General Thorne brought the urgent message directly to Charlotte's private study. James growled dangerously the moment he smelled the sickening scent of the capital. Charlotte calmly broke the thick royal wax and read the elegant, poisonous words. The Crown Prince was hosting a grand, mandatory winter ball in the capital city. The royal family officially commanded the Duke and his new bride to attend. It was completely obvious to everyone that this was a carefully planned trap. The weak, paranoid emperor was utterly terrified of the Duke's restored sanity. He desperately wanted to see if the legendary monster could still be easily controlled. He also wanted to carefully evaluate the unknown southern woman who had tamed him. "We will simply ignore this pathetic piece of paper," James declared coldly. He was fully ready to declare open war rather than let her face the treacherous court. Charlotte smiled a deeply cunning, incredibly sharp smile at her fiercely protective mate. "No, my sweet beast, we are definitely going to attend this little party," she whispered. "If we hide in the snow, they will always foolishly believe we are actually afraid. We must show the entire empire exactly who truly holds the absolute power now." The journey back down south to the royal capital was incredibly swift and heavily armed. They did not travel like a simple noble couple attending a polite social dance. They traveled like conquering royalty with 500 elite northern guards. The grand capital city was shining brightly with thousands of expensive magical lights. The royal palace was absolutely packed with the most powerful, arrogant nobles in the land. Everyone was eagerly waiting to see the ruined, pathetic daughter of the Belmont house. They fully expected to see her violently dragged in by a completely insane, drooling beast. The massive golden doors of the royal ballroom slowly groaned open. The royal announcer loudly declared the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood. The cheerful, loud festive music instantly stopped dead in its tracks. A heavy, completely suffocating silence fell over the massive, crowded room. Charlotte stepped into the blinding light wearing a breathtaking gown of midnight blue. She wore a priceless crown of ancient northern diamonds that perfectly caught the light. She did not look like a discarded, pathetic victim of a ruined family. She looked exactly like a terrifying, untouchable goddess of absolute power. James walked gracefully beside her in a perfectly tailored, pitch-black military uniform. He was completely calm, incredibly handsome, and completely terrifying. His intense, deadly alpha pheromones were perfectly controlled but heavily present. The arrogant, wealthy nobles instinctively parted like a frightened flock of little sheep. They cleared a massive, wide path directly toward the elevated royal throne. The crown prince sat on his high chair, his confident smile instantly freezing on his face. He had expected to easily manipulate a broken man and a weak, traumatized girl. Instead, he was staring directly into the extremely cold eyes of the apex predators. James gently placed his large, heavily scarred hand perfectly on Charlotte's lower back. He openly claimed her in front of the absolute highest power in the entire empire. Anyone who even dared to look at her for too long received a silent, deadly promise of death. Charlotte walked directly up to the base of the royal throne without bowing her head. The dangerous, high-stakes game of imperial politics had just drastically changed its rules. The true, undisputed rulers of the empire had officially entered the grand room. The massive crystal chandeliers above them cast a cold, brilliant light over the silent crowd. The emperor sat stiffly on his grand golden throne, his wrinkled hands trembling slightly. He forced a sickeningly fake smile onto his pale, aged face to welcome the northern rulers. "Welcome back to the beautiful capital, my dear Duke," the emperor announced weakly. James did not bow, nor did he offer any polite, expected verbal response to the crown. He simply stood there entirely like a towering monument of dark, unspoken violence. The arrogant crown prince stepped down from the elevated royal platform with a wicked, confident grin. He was dressed in a ridiculously flashy, heavily decorated gold and crimson military uniform. And this must be the famous, tragic little daughter of the ruined Belmont family, the prince sneered loudly. He deliberately tried to completely humiliate Charlotte in front of the entire glittering imperial court. "We all heard the deeply unfortunate rumors about your terrible, forced marriage in the north. We honestly thought you would not survive a single night with the frozen, barbaric beast." Charlotte looked at the foolish, overconfident prince with absolute, freezing indifference. "Rumors are usually spread by weak men who are entirely terrified of the truth, Your Highness," she replied smoothly. A collective, highly shocked gasp echoed loudly through the massive, extremely crowded ballroom. Nobody in the history of the empire had ever dared to insult the cruel crown prince directly to his face. The prince's fake, arrogant smile instantly vanished, quickly replaced by a dark, ugly scowl. "You have a very sharp tongue for a discarded, entirely worthless omega," he hissed dangerously. He suddenly stepped aggressively into Charlotte's personal space, violating every strict rule of court etiquette. He extended his white-gloved hand toward her in a mocking, deeply insulting invitation. "Let us clearly see if you can dance as well as you can speak, little Duchess." James instantly stepped forward, a low, bone-chilling snarl violently erupting from his broad chest. The suffocating, terrifying pressure of his heavy alpha pheromones instantly flooded the grand room. Several older, weaker nobles actually fainted and collapsed right onto the polished marble floor. The prince's hidden royal guards immediately drew their sharp, highly polished silver swords in panic. The entire imperial ballroom was suddenly pushed to the absolute edge of a massive, bloody massacre. Charlotte simply raised her delicate, pale hand, gently touching James's tense, heavily muscular arm. The terrifying, deadly alpha beast instantly stopped his highly aggressive, forward momentum. He looked down at his beautiful mate, his wild, dangerous eyes completely filled with absolute obedience. "It is perfectly fine, my sweet beast," Charlotte whispered softly, her calm voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "I will gladly humor the foolish prince for one single, completely unforgettable dance tonight." She placed her small, elegant hand lightly onto the prince's stiff, waiting arm. The royal orchestra nervously began to play a fast, incredibly tense traditional waltz. The prince violently pulled Charlotte directly into the absolute center of the massive, empty dance floor. He gripped her fragile waist far too tightly, trying desperately to physically intimidate her. "You are making a massive, deadly mistake, little girl," the prince whispered maliciously directly into her ear. "You're broken, completely insane dog cannot possibly protect you from the true power of the crown. I have heavily armed, elite assassins waiting patiently in every single dark shadow of this palace. I will completely destroy your precious northern army and take absolutely everything you currently own. Charlotte did not break her perfect, icy eye contact as they spun rapidly across the polished floor. You are incredibly naive if you actually believe my husband is my only weapon, she replied coldly. Suddenly, the prince released a highly concentrated, entirely illegal chemical scent from a glass vial in his pocket. It was a dark, synthetic alpha trigger explicitly designed to force a traumatized soldier into a mindless frenzy. He fully expected James to completely lose his mind and indiscriminately slaughter the innocent guests. He desperately wanted the perfect, legal excuse to immediately execute the legendary Duke of Blackwood. The toxic, burning artificial scent rapidly filled the very center of the elegant, crowded ballroom. James smelled the terrible, highly illegal poison instantly from the absolute edge of the room. However, the terrifying, undefeated beast of the north did not go violently insane as planned. He did not roar blindly, and he definitely did not attack the terrified, screaming noble guests. Instead, Charlotte seamlessly released a massive, overwhelming wave of her own pure omega power. Her dominant, majestic white rose scent instantly crushed the prince's pathetic, synthetic poison into nothing. It violently purified the air, completely neutralizing the deadly, cowardly trap in mere seconds. The crown prince gasped heavily for air, his sweaty face turning a sickly, deeply terrified shade of green. He suddenly realized with absolute, crushing horror that he was entirely outmatched on every single level. Guards! Kill the northern monster right now, the panicked prince screamed loudly across the entire room. 20 elite, heavily armed imperial assassins suddenly dropped down rapidly from the high, shadowed balconies. They all rushed aggressively toward James with their poisoned, extremely deadly blades fully drawn. Charlotte simply stopped dancing, letting go of the trembling prince's sweaty hands entirely. Show them exactly why they should truly fear the dark, my love, she commanded calmly. James moved with a terrifying, absolute blur of completely unstoppable, highly lethal speed. He was definitely not fighting like a broken, mindless, chaotic beast in a blind rage. He was fighting with the cold, calculating, and absolutely perfect precision of the Empire's greatest general. He dodged the poisoned blades effortlessly, moving smoothly like a deadly shadow among completely frozen statues. He systematically shattered their arms, painfully cracked their ribs, and threw them violently across the room. It took exactly less than 30 seconds for all 20 elite Imperial assassins to be completely destroyed. They lay groaning and heavily bleeding on the beautiful, completely ruined marble floor. James had not even broken a single sweat, and his expensive black uniform was still completely perfect. He walked slowly and purposefully across the bloody floor, completely ignoring the screaming nobles. He grabbed the terrified crown prince firmly by his ridiculously flashy, highly decorated golden collar. He lifted the pathetic, screaming royal heir completely off his expensive, custom leather boots. James easily carried the thrashing prince directly over to the emperor's grand, elevated golden throne. He threw the cowardly man violently onto the hard stone stairs right at his father's shaking feet. Charlotte walked gracefully over the defeated assassins, her midnight blue gown floating beautifully behind her. She stood right beside her deadly, perfectly controlled husband, looking directly up at the pale emperor. Your foolish son just attempted to illegally assassinate a ruling duke and his duchess, Charlotte announced loudly. He used banned, highly toxic chemical weapons directly inside this very royal ballroom tonight. I have the written, undeniable proof of his illegal purchases safely secured in the north, she lied flawlessly. The emperor shook violently in his seat, looking down at his pathetic, crying son in absolute despair. He knew perfectly well that the angry northern army could easily burn this entire city to the ground by tomorrow. What is your exact demand, Duchess, the broken, deeply terrified emperor finally whispered weakly. Charlotte smiled brightly, a beautiful, truly terrifying expression that promised absolute, undeniable ruin. The North demands complete, permanent independence from your pathetic, rapidly dying empire. And we strongly demand the crown prince be entirely stripped of his royal titles and exiled forever. Or my loyal, beautiful beast will simply tear this entire golden palace apart entirely brick by brick. The silent, heavy ballroom waited in absolute, suffocating terror for the emperor's inevitable, crushing surrender. The majestic, snow-white horses pulled the heavy royal carriage swiftly through the treacherous mountain passes. The thick, heavy iron wheels crushed the freshly fallen snow with a highly satisfying, rhythmic crunching sound. The heavy iron gates of the royal capital had permanently closed behind their massive, moving fortress. They were leaving the treacherous, shining city completely and utterly defeated in their dark wake. The terrified emperor had officially signed the Golden Treaty granting the North absolute, permanent independence. He had practically wept openly as he banished his own cruel, foolish son to the distant, barren wastelands. The glittering, superficial nobles of the capital would whisper fearfully about this unbelievable night for 100 years. They would tell terrified bedtime stories about the beautiful, ruthless Duchess and her dark, invincible warrior. Charlotte sat quietly by the frosty carriage window, watching the beautiful, snowy landscape rush quickly past. The heavy velvet curtains kept the freezing winter air safely outside the warm, dimly lit cabin. She was now the undisputed, absolute queen of the newly established and entirely free Northern Kingdom. James sat in the deep, dark shadows of the opposite seat, completely silent and heavily brooding. He had not spoken a single, comforting word since they left the bloody, chaotic royal ballroom. The legendary beast of Blackwood was currently lost in a very dark, dangerous ocean of his own mind. He kept staring blindly down at his massive, heavily scarred hands with intense, crushing internal guilt. Those exact same hands had effortlessly shattered 20 elite assassins in front of the entire royal court. He knew perfectly well that he was a terrifying, deeply dangerous weapon forged in the fires of endless war. He was absolutely terrified that his beautiful, perfect wife would eventually realize that exact same ugly truth. The heavy carriage suddenly hit a deep, frozen bump in the snowy road, shaking the entire wooden frame violently. Charlotte turned her beautiful head away from the frosty glass and looked directly at her painfully quiet husband. She instantly recognized the dark, suffocating emotional storm slowly gathering inside his wild, beautiful eyes. She gracefully stood up from her plush velvet seat while the carriage continued its rapid, bumpy movement. She crossed the small, intimate space and deliberately sat down directly onto his muscular, incredibly tense lap. James gasped softly, his military instincts instantly wrapping his large, strong arms firmly around her fragile waist. He buried his handsome face deeply into the soft, sweet-smelling curve of her delicate, pale white neck. "You are thinking far too loudly again, my sweet, foolish beast," Charlotte whispered incredibly softly. She gently ran her pale fingers completely through his thick, dark hair, feeling his massive body physically tremble. "I am a terrible, irreversibly broken monster, Charlotte," James finally whispered in a raw, agonizing, broken voice. "I actually enjoyed destroying those miserable assassins back there in that massive, crowded royal room. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, dark satisfaction when I painfully broke their pathetic, fragile little bones." He aggressively tightened his desperate, heavy grip on her waist, pulling her even closer to his racing heart. "I am deeply, constantly terrified that one day you will finally look at me and see the ugly, unforgiving truth. I am profoundly afraid you will quickly realize I am nothing but a violent, deeply traumatized, dangerous dog. I am completely terrified you will eventually leave me all alone in the freezing, unbearable dark forever." A single, boiling hot tear completely escaped from the legendary warrior's deeply exhausted, painfully sad eyes. It fell silently against Charlotte's pale, perfect skin like a tiny drop of pure, agonizing liquid fire. Charlotte absolutely did not pull away from his intense, deeply overwhelming wave of heavy, crushing sorrow. Instead, she gently cupped his handsome, heavily scarred face perfectly with both of her small, delicate hands. She gently forced the towering, incredibly dangerous Alpha to look directly up into her clear, unwavering eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, James Vance, the ruling Duke of the newly independent North," she commanded softly. "You are absolutely not a monster, and you are certainly not a mindless, violent, unpredictable dog. You are the strongest, bravest, and most deeply devoted man I have ever met in my entire, miserable life. Those pathetic, greedy men in the capital desperately wanted to violently destroy us and steal absolutely everything. You simply did exactly what a true, powerful king must do to completely protect his beloved queen and his people." She leaned down slowly and placed a deep, incredibly tender kiss directly over a terrible, jagged scar on his cheek. "My cruel, pathetic family tried to legally feed me to a wild, terrifying beast in the absolute dark. But they accidentally gave me the greatest, most precious, beautiful gift in the entire, vast universe. They gave me a beautiful, fiercely loyal soul who loves and respects me far more than his very own life." James stared blindly up at her with wide, highly vulnerable eyes, his massive, heavily muscled chest rising and falling rapidly. The heavy, suffocating emotional weight of 1,000 terrible, bloody battles suddenly began to magically melt away. "I will absolutely never, ever leave you, my beautiful, brave soldier," Charlotte promised with fierce, undeniable absolute certainty. "I am permanently bound to you for this entire lifetime, and I will gladly, happily choose you again in the next one." She slowly tilted her head slightly to the side, completely exposing the highly sensitive, perfectly unmarked skin of her delicate neck. It was the ultimate, absolutely undeniable sign of complete, willing submission and eternal trust from a highly dominant Omega. "Mark me completely, James," she whispered beautifully, her sweet voice echoing softly over the loud sound of the carriage wheels. "Bind our damaged souls together permanently so you will never, ever have to doubt my absolute loyalty again." The towering, terrifying Alpha let out a deep, highly emotional groan that literally shook the entire wooden carriage. He gently pressed his rough lips against her incredibly soft skin, entirely overwhelmed by pure, burning, endless devotion. He was clearly no longer a broken, discarded weapon of a completely ungrateful, cowardly, and pathetic empire. He was finally entirely home, completely safe inside the warm, fiercely protective arms of his true, forever mate. His sharp, extremely deadly fangs carefully grazed against her actively pulsing vein, seeking silent permission with extreme, touching gentleness. Charlotte simply sighed happily, weaving her small fingers much deeper into his dark hair, entirely surrendering her whole fate to him. When his sharp teeth finally pierced her pale skin, a bright, blinding flash of pure, perfect, spiritual connection flooded both of their minds. The incredibly potent, highly soothing scent of white roses merged completely and flawlessly with the dark, heavy cedar and fresh rain. They were certainly no longer two entirely separate, deeply wounded people constantly fighting entirely alone in a cruel, dark world. They had successfully forged an unbreakable, ancient sacred contract completely written purely in blood, deep affection, and absolute trust. The harsh, freezing winter storm continued to rage violently outside their fast-moving, heavily guarded iron carriage. But deeply inside the small, incredibly intimate warm space, the legendary Duke finally found the absolute, eternal peace he deserved. He slowly pulled back carefully, gently licking the tiny, perfect wound closed with deep, incredible reverence and religious worship. He looked deeply at the permanent, beautiful, highly visible mark on her neck as if it were the absolute holiest artifact on earth. "You are my absolute everything, my beautiful, brilliant queen," James completely vowed solemnly, his dark eyes shining exceptionally brightly. "I will absolutely gladly burn the rest of the entire world to useless ashes if it ever tries to make you shed a single tear again." Charlotte rested her smooth forehead gently against his, smiling incredibly softly as the royal carriage safely carried them toward their new, free empire. The dark, terrible, highly painful chapters of their tragic, abusive pasts were finally, permanently closed and completely sealed shut forever. The long, freezing night was officially over, and a beautiful, golden morning was quickly rising rapidly over the distant northern mountains. The heavy iron carriage finally crossed the ancient stone bridge into the heart of the Northern Territory. The fierce winter storms that usually battered the mountain passes had miraculously cleared away. A brilliant golden sun shone beautifully over the endless, snow-covered peaks. Word of their impossible victory in the capital had traveled faster than the swiftest horses. Every citizen of the harsh, unforgiving north had poured out into the freezing streets to welcome them. They were no longer just welcoming back their terrifying, highly respected military duke. They were passionately cheering for their brand new, undisputed, and fully independent king and queen. Blackwood Manor had been entirely transformed during their short, eventful absence. The ruined, violently destroyed rooms had been repaired and decorated with proud northern banners. It was no longer a dark military fortress designed strictly to hold a mad, broken beast. It was now the magnificent royal palace of a brand new, incredibly powerful empire. Charlotte stepped elegantly out of the carriage into the crisp winter air. She wore a breathtaking gown made of the finest dark velvet and thick white wool fur. James stepped out right behind her, looking exactly like a legendary god of war. He gently took her small gloved hand, leading her proudly up the massive stone steps of their home. General Thorne, the proud commander who had once deeply doubted her, stood waiting at the top. He held a magnificent crown made of indestructible northern steel and dark winter diamonds. He did not look at her with the cold suspicion he had shown just a few months ago. He looked at her with undeniable worship and profound, emotional reverence. "Welcome home, your royal majesties," the old general bellowed loudly over the roaring crowd. He slowly sank down onto both of his armored knees right onto the hard stone stairs. Every single soldier, merchant, and common citizen in the courtyard instantly followed his loyal example. A deafening roar of pure joy echoed throughout the entire frozen valley. James took the beautiful steel crown directly from the general's scarred hands. He did not place it onto his own dark head, entirely ignoring his own ultimate power. He turned to his brilliant mate and gently placed the heavy crown onto her soft hair. "Long live Charlotte, the true queen of the north," James roared with terrifying alpha authority. The armed crowd screamed her name so loudly it literally shook the ancient stone walls. Charlotte looked out over the endless sea of fiercely devoted faces looking up at her. She had successfully survived the darkest nightmare her cruel family could invent. She had been thrown into a bloody cage with a deeply traumatized monster. But she had miraculously turned that terrible cage into an untouchable golden throne. She had taken the most dangerous weapon in the world and turned him into her loving husband. She raised her delicate hand, and the screaming crowd instantly fell into a respectful silence. "We are no longer the forgotten shield of a weak and dying southern empire," she declared loudly. Her clear voice carried flawlessly over the freezing wind, reaching every eager ear. "We will never again bleed alone just to protect those cowardly men in their golden palace. From this glorious day forward, the North officially belongs entirely to the proud people of the North." The crowd erupted again, completely overcome with undeniable national pride. James wrapped his muscular arm tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He looked completely whole, incredibly healthy, and free of his dark past demons. The permanent marking bite on her pale neck pulsed warmly, constantly feeding him calming omega energy. They walked proudly together through the beautifully carved oak doors of their grand royal palace. An incredible celebratory feast had already been perfectly prepared in the grand dining hall. It was a completely different world from the shallow, treacherous parties of the southern capital. Here, the rough generals laughed loudly, drinking thick dark ale by the roaring fireplaces. Here, there was absolutely no hidden poison, no treacherous whispering, and no political games. There was only undeniable loyalty, incredible military strength, and fiercely protected peace. Later that night, Charlotte stood alone on the high stone balcony overlooking her massive new kingdom. The cold wind ruffled the dark banners hanging proudly from the palace walls. Every stone of this ancient fortress now belonged exclusively to her and the man holding her. She remembered the terrified, shivering girl who had arrived here in a torn white dress. That girl was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce ruler who commanded armies and monsters alike. The magical northern lights were dancing beautifully across the endless winter sky. James walked silently up behind her, wrapping a warm wool fur blanket tightly around her shoulders. He buried his handsome face into her soft hair, breathing in her deeply comforting white rose scent. "You gave me back my mind, my soul, and my entire world, Charlotte," he whispered into the freezing night. James kissed the delicate marking scar on her neck, sealing their eternal bond once again. He swore a silent vow to the winter stars to protect her beautiful smile until his very last breath. "And in return, my sweet beast, you gave me an entire kingdom," she replied softly, leaning into his solid warmth. They stood together in perfect, unbreakable harmony as the dawn slowly approached. Their impossible journey from the very bottom of despair to the absolute pinnacle of power was finally complete. The new era of the glorious Northern Kingdom had officially and beautifully begun. 5 peaceful, incredibly prosperous years had passed since the glorious Northern Kingdom declared its absolute independence. The harsh, unforgiving winter lands had been completely transformed under Queen Charlotte's brilliant, merciful rule. Rich, heavy trade wagons now flowed continuously through the massive stone gates every single day. The deeply corrupt, crumbling southern empire they left behind had finally collapsed under its own pathetic greed. The cruel Belmont family and the foolish emperor were now nothing more than forgotten, dusty footnotes in history. But deep inside the magnificent walls of Blackwood Palace, an entirely new, beautiful chapter was currently unfolding. The bright, warm morning sun spilled perfectly across the expensive carpets of the Grand Master bedroom. Charlotte sat comfortably against a massive pile of soft, thick velvet pillows, looking radiantly beautiful and deeply exhausted. She watched her terrifying, legendary husband with an incredibly soft, deeply loving smile on her face. Duke James, the undisputed apex predator of the entire continent, was currently sitting entirely still on the bed. He actually looked more terrified right now than he ever did, facing a massive army of bloodthirsty enemies. In his massive, heavily scarred, lethal hands, he carefully held a tiny, perfect bundle of white silk. It was their brand new, perfectly healthy newborn son, Alexander, the very first true prince of the North. James barely even dared to take a full, deep breath, absolutely terrified of breaking the fragile little creature. His dark, wild eyes, which had witnessed countless brutal wars, were completely filled with absolute wonder. The tiny baby let out a soft, sweet little sigh and immediately reached out a tiny, chubby hand. The little fingers tightly grabbed one of the thick, jagged scars running deeply across the Duke's rough thumb. A heavy, highly emotional tear slowly slipped down the fearsome warrior's face and landed softly on the silk blanket. He had always quietly believed his violently cursed bloodline was destined to bring nothing but deep pain and endless war. But this tiny, deeply innocent child looked exactly like the beautiful woman who had completely saved his broken soul. Charlotte gently shifted on the soft bed, reaching out to softly touch her husband's highly tense, muscular shoulder. The terrifying beast instantly leaned into her warm touch, desperately seeking her constant, grounding, familiar comfort. "He is absolutely perfect, my sweet love," Charlotte whispered sweetly, her tired voice full of immense, overflowing pride. "He is entirely too small, Charlotte," James replied in a thick, hoarse whisper, his broad chest trembling slightly. "My dark hands were only ever created to completely destroy things, not to hold something this incredibly pure and innocent." Charlotte simply smiled and gently placed her own delicate, pale hand perfectly over his massive, shaking one. "Your incredibly brave hands were created to fiercely protect exactly this, James," she corrected him with absolute, undeniable certainty. "You fought through 1,000 terrible nightmares just so our beautiful son could finally be born into the peaceful light." General Thorne, now much older but still fiercely proud, waited respectfully outside the heavy oak bedroom doors. The entire massive Northern army was currently waiting in the stone courtyard, holding their collective breath in pure anticipation. James finally stood up slowly, holding the tiny, sleeping prince securely against his broad, heavily muscled chest. He carefully helped his brilliant queen to her feet, safely supporting her entire weight with his endless, gentle strength. Together, they walked slowly out onto the grand, high stone balcony overlooking their massive, thriving capital city. The absolute second the eager, waiting crowd saw their beloved rulers and the tiny white bundle, the valley exploded. Tens of thousands of fiercely loyal citizens and heavily armored soldiers cheered so loudly the mountains literally shook. It was a deafening, truly beautiful sound of pure, absolute victory and long-lasting, incredibly hard-earned peace. Charlotte leaned her tired head perfectly against James's strong, completely unmovable, protective shoulder. She gently closed her beautiful eyes, letting the overwhelming roar of the massive crowd wash over her like a warm river. She quickly remembered the terrified, discarded girl shivering entirely alone in a broken carriage on a dark, stormy night. That pathetic, weak victim was entirely dead, replaced forever by a legendary queen who confidently ruled the world. She had not just barely survived the violent, highly unpredictable storm of her tragic, deeply abusive early life. She had successfully tamed the darkest, most terrifying lightning and made it her absolute, eternally loyal servant. James turned his handsome head and pressed his rough, warm lips firmly against the permanent mating mark on her neck. The powerful, deep spiritual connection between their highly bonded souls flared brightly with infinite, unconditional love. "I am entirely yours, in this bright life and every single one that beautifully follows," the fearsome Duke vowed eternally. "And you are forever my sweet, beautiful beast," Charlotte answered softly, looking proudly out at their glorious, golden empire. The dark, tragic fairy tale of the ruined daughter and the mad beast had finally reached its perfect, absolute end. But the magnificent, highly legendary history of the great Northern Kingdom had only just begun to be beautifully written.